Now, we often hear that global warming or climate change is at catastrophic levels, and humans need to take action to prevent destroying the planet.
But how serious is it really? Is there a biblical way to approach this controversial topic? Today on Creation Magazine Live.
Welcome to the first episode of Season 9 of Creation Magazine Live.
Season 9.
Yeah, I'm Richard Fangrad.
And I'm Matt Bondi.
Now, when visiting churches, CMI speakers often get asked about climate change. That's not surprising since we employ Bible-believing scientists, and many Christians are looking for direction on the issue by informed researchers. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, the issue that many are near hysterical about is that atmospheric temperature is supposedly going up because humans are producing too much carbon dioxide.
Right.
And if temperature goes beyond a certain threshold, it'll be catastrophic for life on Earth. That's called anthropogenic global warming.
Oh, whoa. Can you say that one again?
It's anthropogenic, means man-made.
Okay, man-made.
Yep.
Right, and that leads to a key point that we need to clarify here. It's not just, is there climate change, but are humans to blame?
Yes.
Two separate questions
Yep.
there. Now, this is a huge topic, and today we'll begin to examine the issue from a Christian and scientific perspective, but we won't have time to cover all the points this half hour, so we'll extend this topic to next week's show too and address whether climate is changing. If so, how drastic is it? Are humans to blame, and how should Christians respond?
Yeah, lots of questions.
Yeah.
Almost all the content for these two shows comes from a massive article on our website by Dr. Don Batten with contributions from Bible-believing scientists from all around the world. Even with 2 half-hour shows dedicated to this topic, we're only summarizing the main points. So for more details, check out that article at creation.com/climate change.
Now, we're covering this topic because it has a lot to do with worldviews. A view of the world, an all-encompassing perspective on everything that exists and matters to us. A person's worldview represents his most fundamental beliefs and assumptions about the universe he inhabits. And different worldviews will produce different reactions and actions to the topic of climate change.
Right, yeah. And our Christian, or let's say biblical worldview compels us to revere the God of creation. Some of the principles relevant to today's subject are the universe and earth were created through and for Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and the earth was also created for mankind.
We're called to be holy and blameless in Jesus Christ.
Christ holds his creation together.
We are to worship the Creator, not the creation, or Gaia, or Mother Earth.
Mankind is called to steward God's creation.
Yes?
See, as Christians, we affirm that we have responsibility to look after the environment. We are also compelled to consider the poor and the general welfare of our neighbors, among other things.
Yeah, so those are some of the basics foundational to the Christian worldview that provide really a starting point for understanding this issue of climate change.
Yeah. Building on from there, we need to be mindful of the real history of the world from the Bible.
Yes.
Especially those events that would impact climate change and the climate change debate. And we'll contrast this history with the naturalistic history and worldview where there is no God. So, everything came from nothing, natural processes over billions of years. Humans are no more important than cows or trees or cockroaches for that matter.
Oh, yeah.
You see, some claim that the environment was, fine for hundreds of millions of years until man came along and messed it up. But in the biblical view, from the beginning, humans were created to care for and rule over the earth.
Yeah, and those are really different worldviews.
Right.
Now, another major historical event related to climate change happened about 4,500 years ago. Noah's flood covered the earth in water and buried massive amounts of vegetation and animals, turning them into coal and other fossil fuels. Nearly all of today's coal was formed from the vegetation buried during Noah's flood. The huge amount of buried vegetation suggests that pre-flood CO2 levels must have been very high compared to today levels. CO2 is plant food.
Right. Even secular geologists agree that ancient Paleozoic CO2 levels were much higher, like even 15 times more than they are today. Yeah.
Way higher.
Yeah, there's no evidence that the Earth was, cooked by this situation of, a runaway greenhouse effect or something. The much higher CO2 levels would boost plant productivity and also allow for much more animal biomass.
Right, yeah. Another key event to consider is that the flood created ideal conditions for an ice age for a few hundred years following the flood. These were both catastrophic climate events. Since then, there have been, comparatively minor fluctuations in climate. Our environment is designed to be reasonably stable. As Genesis 8:22 suggests, while earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease.
Yeah, now naturalists deny a global flood and claim, many ice ages over millions of years.
Right.
This is based largely on the Milankovitch theory, which suggests small wobbles in the Earth's orbit around the sun over long periods of time resulted in slight differences in solar radiation. But the small differences they propose can't really create the massive changes in the environment needed for an ice age. So instability is built into the models.
The key.
And they think about it like this. I mean, if a little change in sunlight can cause radical change in climate, then a little change in greenhouse gases like CO2 should maybe do the same.
Yeah, so there's one of the bases for climate alarmism, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you believe that little changes produce massive ice ages, then little changes in CO2 might very well cook the Earth.
Yeah. Another event to consider is that, yes, God created everything very good originally, but because Adam sinned, creation is cursed and is in a state of decay. Romans 8 says that the creation was subjected to futility and is currently in bondage to corruption. But God promises to restore this decaying creation, turning it into the new heavens and new earth where believers will spend eternity with him.
The book of Revelation describes future events and talks about this current earth as, past tense, saying the first heaven and the first earth had passed away.
Yes.
Christians have, been commanded to look after the earth, but our hope is in something far better that's yet to come.
Yeah, and naturalism doesn't offer a hope like that. So you can see why naturalists might want to overemphasize or even distort the severity of climate change. You think this Earth is that's all we have, right? Or Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX, wants to make humans a multi-planetary species. One of the reasons he wants to colonize Mars is so that humans could survive an extinction event on Earth, like World War III or climate change.
Right. There's also hints of Gaia worship among some environmentalists who see humans as, evil for using up resources.
Yes.
They sort of equate, this with killing Mother Earth. And that is a little bit different from naturalism as it involves worshiping creation, but it does still figure into this whole climate change issue.
Right. And finally, God is sovereign.
Right.
He's in control of history and weather and all the creation, guiding it to the end that he's decreed, despite all attempts by humans to control their destiny. He made us caretakers, but we have a limited amount of control there.
That's right. For naturalists, if there's no God and if humans are responsible for destroying the environment, then I guess it's assumed that only humans can fix it.
Right, yeah. The climate change debate is largely dominated by the worldview coming out of naturalism. So Christians need to be a little careful, on one hand, not to reject the whole issue because of that, and on the other hand, not to blindly accept the statements from climate leaders, climate change leaders.
Yeah.
We need to treat this issue with wisdom, and we'll outline the foundation for that in a moment.
Did you know that the DNA code is itself governed by another code known as the epigenetic code? This physical and chemical code determines which genes are switched on. Changes in this code can greatly alter an organism without altering one letter of its DNA. For instance, scientists have managed to change the coat colour in mice by feeding them a diet that switches off certain genes. Epigenetics poses new problems for evolution. For instance, a group of animals with a camouflaged coat colour might be favoured in a particular environment, but if this coat colour is due to epigenetics and not the actual DNA code, then the non-camouflaged animals would be selected against in vain. When the epigenetic modification is reset by a diet change, natural selection is sent back to square one. The field of epigenetics therefore creates problems for evolution and strongly points to a master programmer who invented the DNA and epigenetic codes.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Hey, CMI needs your support. Give the video a like, subscribe, and share the video on Twitter and Facebook.
That's right. This shows the algorithm that you appreciate the content.
Bible-believing scientists worked for months to gather the data, sifting through huge amounts of research on climate change to produce the article on which the show is based.
Yeah, the result was a 14,000-word article at creation.com/climate change.
And today's episode summarizes some of that content.
Now, let's learn about the science behind climate change.
So how scientific is climate change? Well, here are 5 considerations about how science works and how this impacts the science of climate change. One basic tenet of science is that it is testable.
Right.
The heart of the scientific method is that hypotheses can be tested with experiments. And, after doing a number of experiments, the results allow the calculation of a confidence in the conclusion being true and, not just some random variation.
Right, yeah.
Now, probability of 95% is normally the lowest accepted in science. So in other words, it's okay if one experiment in 20 gives a false result.
Okay, yeah. In climate science, the observation is that global temperature has been going up as well as the level of CO2. The hypothesis is that CO2 released into the atmosphere by human activity is causing the higher temperature.
Now, the problem is that it's not possible to design a repeatable experiment to test this hypothesis.
That's right.
Because of the size, complexity, and uniqueness of the system. I mean, after all, there's only one planet Earth, and it's rather complicated.
A little, yeah.
So we're left with conjectures and predictions. Applying statistical models to the past temperature data can generate a prediction for the future, but the confidence limits are so wide that the predictions are, kind of useless.
Yeah, and this approach can't say whether CO2 is causing the change.
Right.
So the climate models that predict a temperature response to CO2 have to be deterministic. That is, they have to assume that the inputs will determine the temperature. So the assertion, based on these models, that CO2 causes global warming is actually circular reasoning. And that's a big no-no in science.
Yes, it is. Okay, so the second point is that science cannot prove theories to be true, only false.
Right.
Observing a result, predicted by a hypothesis, that doesn't prove the hypothesis, as there may be other explanations. So higher temperatures, for example, could be the result of something other than CO2.
It's possible, yeah.
Yeah, but if the data shows higher temperatures with lower levels of CO2, that would disprove the hypothesis.
Right, yeah. Number 3, correlation doesn't mean causation. So even if the CO2 levels and the temperatures are both on the rise, it doesn't prove that one caused the other.
Right.
Like, for example, between June and December of 2008, both the temperature in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and the Toronto Stock Exchange decreased dramatically. But no one has ever blamed the stock market for the plunge in Calgary weather.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay.
No causation there.
Okay, number 4, science is often captured by a ruling paradigm. A paradigm is a framework used by default to interpret data. For example, since mainstream science is dominated by naturalism, conclusions that include a creator or intelligent designer are automatically excluded.
Yeah.
In climate science, this can be leaving out explanations other than man-made CO2.
Right. Number 5, peer review lends credibility to research, but it doesn't ensure truth necessarily. There are many examples of failure in the peer review process within climate science as well as other disciplines.
Yeah. So you can see how the climate change issue is quite complex.
Yes.
We've just briefly outlined 5 things to consider about how science works and some of the challenges in applying good scientific practices to the climate change debate. Before that, we looked at historical considerations that would really dramatically impact how we understand or prioritize atmospheric data.
Yes.
And we began with outlining worldview considerations.
Yeah, okay, so with all these considerations, now let's dive into some of the data.
Okay.
Hey, thanks for watching. Wow, that was the first episode of season 9.
Yeah, season 9. Hey, CMI, Creation Ministries International, is an international Christian think tank organization with offices in 7 countries.
That's right, we provide perspective on issues like climate change from a Christian worldview.
So leave a comment and tell us what surprised you the most in this episode.
To support CMI directly, if you want to do that, visit creation.com/donate to keep creationist research coming.